injuries like TBI. There can also be like a psychological component in terms of changing somebody's personality, because the brain is so nuanced and interesting that depending on where the injury occurs, it can impair like executive functioning, for example. So like people become more impulsive, or they can become more forgetful, or they're not able to process things the way they once could, even just like basic things, like basic cognition. Oftentimes what we see with like severe TBIs is that people just have complete personality changes, and it's borne out and documented by their friends and family members. So it might be like, a wife, for example, and her husband's like, oh, she was never like this before. Like she can't remember where the keys are, or she goes to the fridge and she can't remember, what she wanted to get out of the fridge, or things like that. So, it's not just an injury to the brain that would show up on an MRI. We had one case with a really severe TBI where the client had to get airlifted to a hospital and have an emergency craniotomy. And so they removed a piece of her skull to alleviate the pressure and the swelling. Because of the nature of the injury, the brain and the brain cavity might still continue to fill up with fluid. So they had to put in a shunt, like a metal shunt, to alleviate the fluid so it didn't keep refilling with fluid and swelling up. So that's a really extreme case. When that happens, it'll leave like what they call like a lesion, right? Like a mark on the brain, kind of like if you punch yourself really hard and you get a bruise. So if you have a really bad injury to the brain, you'll have a lesion on the brain. Sometime after that, if you get a brain MRI, they can see that spot on the brain. So that's objective evidence of a brain injury. Sometimes they'll refer to it as an artifact. They'll be like, oh, we see this old artifact in the brain, which is basically like a bruise on the brain, because you had that injury there, you had blood there, and then even though the blood dissipates, it'll leave what they call, it's basically iron deposits from the iron in the brain. So it'll leave like, I think they call it like hemosiderin deposit, but it's basically like leftover iron in the brain that also will indicate that you once had an injury there. So it's kind of like a leftover bruise on the brain, right? And then again, depending on the area of the brain where the impact occurs, like it could be in the front of the brain, the side of the brain, or whatever, that also might influence what type of symptoms you have as a result of the brain injury. So again, some of the most common symptoms that we see from a brain injury are ringing in the ears, tinnitus or tinnitus, depending on how you pronounce it, sensitivity to light, balance issues like vertigo issues, headaches, nausea. So those are some of the symptoms to monitor after having, any type of suspected brain injury. And sometimes when people have balance issues and vertigo issues and ringing in the ears, the neurologist will recommend like vestibular treatment to assist with that. He might recommend other types of studies to document the severity of the brain injury. He might recommend a brain MRI. I'll just throw out the disclaimer that obviously we're not medical doctors. We know a lot of this stuff just by handling these cases for so long and taking it upon ourselves to become so well versed in it.